Kia ora, 여러분. Lovely to see you all here tonight. It's Friday night. I know everyone is busy, and it's old tradition to be with friends on Friday nights. And well, I'm particularly pleased to see so many high-ranking, very well-esteemed politicians here too. Coming from Australia this morning, I've been thinking that, well, these days, we were separated or divided or linked by the Tasman Strait. Now the Parliament House in Australia has an unusually high number of New Zealanders. So obviously, New Zealand is a country of influence in Australian politics. But well, it's always good to be here, and I'm particularly grateful to the New Zealand Republic of Korea Friendship Society. 여러분들 안녕하십니까? 호주에서 온 지 몇 시간밖에 안 되었습니다. 그런데 정말 아름다운 해밀턴시에 있기가 정말 반갑고 한유 우정협회에서 초대를 받게 돼서 정말 반갑고 아주 영광스럽습니다. Today I'm going to talk about the topic which is and has been in the news for quite a while, and it looks like Korea attracts more and more attention. In general, well, I started. Richard introduced me. I come from Russia. I studied Russian vision of Korean history and the Russian understanding of Korean drama. And I think when I come to Australia and New Zealand, I have something to share, my personal insight into this drama, this Pundan Segi, really the age of division, something what people in the Western world have never really experienced. Yes, Australia and New Zealand participated in the Korean War. Yes, Australian and New Zealanders can go to Korea, north and south, but do we really understand what is going behind this facade of confrontation, this continuing drama of misunderstanding and ostensible absence of appetite for reconciliation? What is going on in Korea? So today I'm going to discuss and present to you my personal view of the inter-Korean cooperation and possibility and pathways towards unification. So 남북 협력과 통일 방안에 대해서 말씀드리고 저희 연구한 것은 물론 부족한 것이 많지만 여러분들 지시해 주시기 많이 바랍니다. So I'll try to give you my personal understanding of what has been going on in Korea for these last 67 years, and try to give you some kind of projection of what may happen and what should we do to avoid the worst scenario and to prepare the scenario which can be potentially beneficial, a win-win solution. So my talk tonight is has two purposes. One is just to look at Korean nation as one which has been striving all the time for unification. I briefly give you my insight and a brief overview of 5,000 of Korean history. 5,000 years. Koreans have been living together on the peninsula and trying to live as one country, one nation, one culture, sharing one language and one blood. But at the same time, Korea has been suffering from numerous foreign invasions. And Korea has always been a bone of contention for regional powers. These days, well, we live in a year of globalization, so power, they still have vested interest in the Korean peninsula. If you look at the map of Korea, you see that the peninsula looks like a natural bridge between the landmass of the continent, Eurasian continent, and the Pacific. And well, that's why Australians, New Zealanders have so much interest in what is going on in Northeast Asia, because it's our region. We have to be prepared for potential change of status quo, and the status quo has been quite stable. The balance of threat, the balance of terror for the last almost 70 years after the end of the war. So here's I listed the conflicts which engulfed the Korean Peninsula. Starting from the Mongolian, we probably can talk about Koguryo, Sui dynasty wars, but probably too deep in history. But the Mongols tried to conquer Japan in the 13th century. They didn't manage it. Korea was blocking the land mass from Japan. The Manchu Qing dynasty invasion also pursued the purpose of controlling the peninsula. They managed to do so, but the Koreans retained their national identity, and they remained more Confucian, more traditionalist than Manchu Chinese themselves. Sino-Japanese War, if you remember, the 19th century conflict was about Korea, where Japan, which a newly modernized nation, tried to control and dominate the Korean peninsula and take Korea outside of the sphere of orbit of influence of China. Russo-Japanese War again was about Korea, where Russians lost their Baltic fleet, the majority of their assets in Manchuria, because they could not match the power of modernizing Japan. And finally, Korea itself fell prey to Japanese colonialism. All these wars, I can assure you, remembered in Korea. Koreans have this DNA memory of all these invasions. Koreans from their childhood always talk that our small country has always been very patriotic, very can try to be unified and protect its own identity in the face of all these foreign invasions. Even the Japanese colonization could not break it despite all efforts. So when Japan surrendered, and you understand it actually happened quite unexpectedly for many people, because it was a result of nuclear bombing. First time in human history, nuclear bomb was dropped on civilian and military targets. The war ended, but the drama of the Korean people didn't. What happened very soon after the surrender of Japan? The Soviet army advanced from the north, the Manchurian plains of Manchuria in the north, and the United States occupied Japan, the South Pacific, and was advancing. The troops were advanced from the south. The drama of Koreans started with the division, artificial division of the peninsula by at the stroke of the pen from Stalin and Truman. Both strong men decided that it would be much more logical to avoid direct confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States. The Cold War was brewing at that time. Already, like first days after the end of the Second World War, the new conflict was on the rise, and Korea was its first victim. The imaginary line of the 38th parallel was drawn in order to delineate the responsibility for the surrender of Japanese military. Soviet army arrived just in a matter of days. Americans arrived a little bit later, and we see that the conflict, which was already, had beset the Korean nation during the Japanese colonialism, became very acute in those first days and weeks and months after the liberation. So the question is: was Korea really liberated, or was it reoccupied? That's a moot point which historians discuss and debate until now, because if you look at how this liberation happened and what was imposed on Koreans, it actually looked quite. It was done in a very, very brutal way. Koreans were denied of their right of independence until due day, until sometime in the future. A so-called trustship of Allied powers was supposed to look after the Korean independence and create and impose its rule on the Koreans. While people of Korea had lived for 5,000 years in their state, and they had their own bright, vivid history, unique language. Many of you, I'm sure, have family members who suffered from the communization of North Korea. But also what was going in South Korea was also very dramatic, and this conflict between the rich and poor, the conflict between people from the left and people from the political right. The conflict was already sitting there for decades. And it just took two conflicting powers to arrive on the Korean Peninsula when this conflict became absolutely unavoidable. The population, you can see in the North Korea, was always roughly half of that of the population in the south. And the leadership of the two nation states which were forming between 1945 and 1948 was also diametrically opposite. So we can see the leftist groups which were shipped by the Russians to North Korea and given the full reign in setting up the communist state in the north. And people who were American educated, people who believed in liberal democracy were brought to Korea by Americans and given a chance to set up the nation state in Seoul, with capital in Seoul. The conflict was becoming unavoidable, and the conflict came just a mere 5 years after the liberation. The imaginary line turned into the front line very soon, and it was just a matter of time before one side would attack the other. And it happened first in 1950, June 25th, when Kim Il-sung and the Communist Army attacked the south, pushed the front line to the Busan perimeter, and they nearly unified the peninsula. The war started as a war of unification. The original intention of Kim Il-sung and his Communist Army was to unify the peninsula under the communist rule. International community stepped in very swiftly, and with the United Nations and initially 15 countries, further 22 countries participated in this operation. They managed to push the line closer to the Chinese border, but only to face the Chinese invasion. Chinese People's Volunteers stepped in and turned the tide of the war back to actually where it started. And you see the Armistice Agreement was signed in 1953, almost where the war started, slightly north of the 38th parallel, but the negotiation, the Kaesong, the city, the ancient capital of Korea, is just exactly on the 38th parallel. So people still remember this drama, the war which is often known in the West as a forgotten war. It's not forgotten in Korea. Dramas and novels, poetry and songs, all written about this conflict, about this war. Why is that so? This take a key is the Korean flag. But the English translation of the film is the Brotherhood at War, because originally and fundamentally this was a fratricidal war, which was, I believe, was instigated by the foreign conflicting powers. The context of this war was Cold War confrontation. Koreans simply found themselves in the context of growing Cold War ideological confrontation between communism and anti-communism, between liberal democracy and communism. The war technically ended or stopped, the fire stopped, the truce was signed in 1953. It was interpreted differently. South Koreans even refused to sign the Armistice Agreement. North Koreans, on the opposite, proclaimed a great victory. What really happened? In fact, it was just a mere ceasefire, which was signed by the United Nations Command on one side, by Chinese People's Volunteer Commander, and the North Korean Communist Army commander. And the original intention of this armistice agreement was to turn it into the peace treaty within 12 months. It didn't happen before 2 years, after the first negotiations were resumed in Geneva, and they failed. Koreans couldn't agree on the terms of potential peace. Americans were on one side, Russians were on the other side, and the conflict continued. Until now, we see this zone of separation, the demilitarized zone, the 4 kilometers zone, which separates the peninsula into two halves, and a no-man's zone full of landmines, and demilitarized is probably a misnomer. It's heavily militarized, the scariest place in the world, as former President Clinton named it, 145 kilometers strip of land, which separates the nation, brothers and sisters, mother from son, former husband and former wife, people who could not meet after that for decades, and probably died without seeing their loved ones. No telephone calls, no letters, no communication, no visits were permitted since then. So the results, what was the result of this war, of this bloody conflict? It was horrendous. The number of North Korean and South Korean militaries just dwarfed by the number of civilians died during this conflict. Nobody really knows how many women, children, and elderly people died during this fratricidal conflict. And the war actually ended where it started. It didn't materialize, it didn't bring unification, it didn't bring any happiness, it brought more pain and more agony, which is still continuing until now. So that's what I'm going to talk about. This part of my presentation is about continuing Korean conflict and cooperation as well, because cooperation didn't start until some almost 20 years after the armistice agreement was signed. And the cooperation between North and South initially started in a very clandestine manner. The chief of KCIA, Korean Central Intelligence Agency, Lee Hoo-rak, traveled to Pyongyang at the order of President Park Geun-hye. Initially, it was too sensitive to make it public. And finally, when South Koreans realized that North Koreans also have the appetite for discussion, for dialogue, for communication, and cooperation, potentially reconciliation, and possibly unification, it was a sensation. The news broke out in July 1972 about the main principles, the main unification principles, which Koreans already formulated then: independence, peace, and grand national unity. Three main principles of national unifications were encoded in the future negotiations. But unfortunately, the negotiations broke down. It was impossible to continue negotiations between the communist North and the capitalist South, not democratic yet South, in this context of general global divide between the Soviet Union and the United States, Cold War, confrontation. Still, Koreans managed to maintain some line of communication, and then when the communist bloc started falling apart, it was already the sign given to Koreans that it's time to resume communication. And the first exchange of the divided families happened then in mid-80s. So we can see that it took, how much? It took about initially 20 years before the first communication happened. Then about 12 years later, first contact, first exchange. And again, 10 years later after that, new motion, new process of national reconciliation was resumed by the first as a result of democratization of South Korea, but also famine in the north, and it provided the stage for a new dialogue. So what was happening next is extremely important. I think it gave a fantastic case study of the possibility of North and South Koreans to talk. Well, we all remember that South Korea was, despite of its intention to be a democratic and wealthy, market-oriented country, it was a dictatorship for a number of decades, run by our president and later dictator Park Geun-hye. So the forces of opposition tried to raise the issue of national unification, and the leader of opposition, Kim Tae-jung, was often talking about necessity of cooperation, economic cooperation between North and South. Because you remember what happened with the division. When North was separated from the South, the North was doomed to starve, because North Korea is a mountainous country. It's how many days per year they have freezing temperatures?
When you ask them what the climate is, they never say we get so many days of sunshine or inches of rain. They say something like we get 172 frost-free days a year.
Exactly. And South Korea was not simply didn't have any industries. because the Japanese colonization was aiming at plundering the resources. So the mountainous areas, which are in the north, provided the excellent foundation for the building of industries. So when Korea became divided, so South Korea was without any heavy industries. Traditionally it had been the rice bowl of Korea, so they had a lot of rice, but the population was double compared to the north, so they had more mouths to feed. No interaction, no electricity, and all electricity, electric power grids and power plants were in the north because of the rivers, because of the mountainous terrain. So South Korea was left without access to electricity. So it was a total economic disaster. And after the war, South Korea, you know, it's the 11th largest economy in the world. After the war, for a number of decades, 1950s and 1960s, South Korea was one of the poorest countries of East Asia. While North Korea in 1950s and 60s, very soon after the war, they managed to restore the economy because of the help from the Soviet Union and other communist countries bloc. North Korea was the second most industrialized nation in East Asia after Japan. Japan was the powerhouse of East Asia, very quickly recovering after the war. But you imagine how much Japan was never, the economy was damaged by the war. But the extent of the Korean War was complete devastation of all this infrastructure. So Koreans needed cooperation. Koreans had something to offer to each other, but for political reasons, they were not doing that. And Kim Tae-jung, the leader of opposition and the future president of Republic of Korea, proposed a 3-stage model for unification, starting from a confederal model, where two nations would be simply symbolically trying to unify, but would retain their institutions completely independent, following the independent different policies, in view of future federalization and potentially complete reunification. Now, tell me please, could this plan be realized? Confederation, federation, unification. Does it sound plausible? Right? Well, many people believed it could, but North Koreans realized that there's something is wrong with this confederation model and it has to be more elaborated. And the secret is because of the difference in the population. Right? North Korea has only half of the population than the South. When you have federation, confederation, it's fine, but with federation in the future, it will inevitably struck the problem of representative, democracy mechanism. How it is going to happen? So Kim Il-sung in North Korea, mentioned and started talking about the Koryo Confederal Republic, where the two parts should be represented equally. That's why confederation was emphasized rather than federation. But what will happen next if South Koreans are underrepresented? North and South Koreans talk about completely, they use different language. They use, now the economy is based after this, how many years? 1980s, so 30 years later, after this division, North Korea was completely centralized economy. South Korea was already a blooming economic, like market or export-oriented economy with growing export figures. So basically, North and South realized that there's not much they can do about this unification. It was simply the stillborn idea, right? The plan of confederation of federation would be unfeasible. Confederation potentially, but for confederation, well, what would be needed, right? What Kim Il-sung and Kim Tae-jung were talking about actually materialized later, another 10 years further down the track, when this so-called Sunshine Policy, the brainchild of President Kim Tae-jung, was introduced. Here you can see the picture of President Kim meeting with Chairman Kim, Chairman of National Defense Committee in Pyongyang. A sensational summit, 2000. During that summit, they sat down and formulated the principles of national. They created the joint statement of national unification. So President Kim Tae-jung, it was a quite dramatic story of him becoming president. South Korea, again, it was a roller coaster of economic, boost and bust, boom and bust, where South Korean economy found itself technically bankrupt in 1997 as a result of Asian financial crisis. Former president was out, President Kim was elected, and it was more than just focus on economy. The idea was to offer a new vision for the Korean nation, and that's what President Kim formulated in his 3 principles of North Korea policy for the Republic of Korea. No military actions or provocations from North Korea would be tolerated. That was said very clearly from the beginning. Also, no plans for the takeover and absorption were brought forward, which was a very important message for North Korea. Don't need to be afraid of us. We're not going to, march north and unify, or unification by absorption is not in our plans. It was very important to mention that. And social political cooperation was emphasized, but its graduality, step by step, kind of ratcheting up joint projects was also talked about. Not an instant cultural domination of South over North, or was never mentioned. So it was a quite sort of conservative approach to the idea of inter-Korean cooperation. And this policy was called Sunshine. Do you know this Aesop fables? Right? Where a man was wearing a coat, where it was very hard to have someone to open up, but when the sun comes, you feel warm, you feel open, and you take off your clothes. You don't need to force anyone to do anything. You do it naturally. This was the intention of the Sunshine Policy. This was a conceptual understanding that these principles of flexible reciprocity must be kind of lying as a foundation of Sunshine Policy. Very simple things, right? Give first, take later. Do simple task first and progress to the complex tasks later. Non-government organizations and structures first would start trade and talk and cooperate, and governments will step in later. Right? Do you think these expectations are reasonable? Does it make sense? Simple. So it immediately did the trick, and we saw it. It was proclaimed in 1998. In 2000, Kim Tae-jung was already in Pyongyang, drinking wine and singing "우리 서부는 통일" together. The song which you've just heard. It's a very well-known song in both North and South. Amazing. 60 years of total separation, and the people sing the same song. They dream about unification, but probably they understand it differently. So the 5 tasks of Sunshine Policy which were emphasized were actually dwelling on the understanding that the Cold War mentality must be dismantled. With continuing Cold War confrontation, we'll never ever achieve our dream. Our sovereign 통일 is actually the product of this long-going confrontation. And first of all, the reconciliation must be achieved. Right? We don't need to think about unification before we reconcile. And reconciliation may take much, much longer. Unification is a technical process of institutional merger. Can be done later down the track, unless you normalize the relationship between the former benefactors or former countries which contributed to the conflict. The United States on one side, Australia, New Zealand also participated in the conflict, and China and Russia on the other side. When Gorbachev talked to Reagan about the future post-Cold War world and the role of Korea in this, the intention was that Soviet Union and China would recognize diplomatically South Korea, and the United States and Japan would diplomatically recognize North Korea, and then there will be no ground for conflict. Isn't it simple? Easy. So Moscow and Beijing recognized Seoul in 1990 and 1994. 1992, I'm sorry. But Washington and Tokyo never recognized Pyongyang. For the opening of North Korea, the fable of Aesop may sound good, but for the regime, the communist regime, which is based on fear and coercion and ideology and brainwashing, it easy to say, hard to do. So the opening for North Korea is out of question, because people live in North Korea for these 65, 64 years of like after the war, in total isolation in North Korea. How many of you have been to North Korea? Peter was there, Richard, yes. Right, in North Korea, how many newspapers do they have? 3, 4 newspapers. They reproduce the same news. How many TV channels? 1. And I actually forgot, when I was in Pyongyang last year, I switched on my TV in the morning, wanted to know the news. There was BBC and CNN and Sky News, but I wanted to watch North Korean news in the morning. And it was not working. So I went downstairs to the reception and said, something's wrong with the TV. I can't get the North Korean news, this morning news. And they told me, we don't have morning news. So it started 4:00 p.m. evening. So there's no news in North Korea. News is the same. Everyone knows the news. The leader is great. The country is perfect. Everything is going to be fine. So opening is democratization or this process. Something what Kim Tae-jung was dreaming about is not going to happen or easily, or unless something really changes in North Korea. Weapons. Why weapons of mass destruction is so important for North Korea? Here we're coming closer to this current situation of almost daily breaking news of a detonation or launch or some kind of crisis, nuclear armada coming. For North Korea, weapons of mass destruction is a psychological deterrent. It doesn't matter how many bombs they have. One is enough. As long as North Koreans have one nuclear device, the regime can sleep quietly and can be quite confident that no one would dare to change the regime. No preemptive strike, no precision attack, no regime change is going to be undertaken because it's a nuclear weapon. No one is going to have uncontrolled nuclear or thermonuclear explosion in the heavily populated peninsula, surrounded by powerhouse of Japan, China, Russia. So for North Koreans also, weapons of mass, like rockets. See, rockets also can be, it's a dual usage technology. Rocket not necessarily brings death and destruction. Rocket can also bring a satellite into the orbit and help forecasting weather and improve agriculture. So nuclear program has the same dual purpose. You can create bombs, but you can also generate electricity. We live in the 21st century. We have to explore. North Koreans believe that they're entitled to explore outer space. They're entitled to have their own sophisticated modern communication technologies. So for them, it's a great matter of pride to have their own nuclear and rocket technologies for dual peace, and we'll talk about this more. So I want to have this understanding that they're not the warmongering nation which are hell-bent on destruction of everyone around. The regime may be, but not the people. Transforming the system. And the peace system, well, we live, you see, when I hear the news of another nuclear test or another missile being launched, well, for Donald Trump, it's an invitation for war. I actually look at it as an invitation to the negotiation table. It looks like North Korea or Kim's regime is desperate to start or resume negotiations. I read it like this. Maybe you disagree with me. Let's see what was going on next. Well, the Sunshine Policy was progressing, and it was going on for about 10 years altogether. During that time, the successor of President Kim Tae-jung drive their cars across the demilitarized zone. Well, it had been unimaginable, say, in 1960s, 70s, and 80s. In 2004, you could drive your own car. The train was crossing the demilitarized zone. Well, it was an empty train. There's not much of commodities to transport, but twice a year was going from south to the north in the morning and returning in the evening. Sometimes bring sand or some construction materials. North and South Koreans found the place where they could meet each other and talk and learn about each other in Kaesong Industrial Park, Kaesong Kongdan. 50,000. 30 is probably, it's a conservative figure, but closer to the end, when it shut down just last year, was 50,000 North Korean women, skilled workers, and about 1,000 South Korean managers. South Korean money investors would go there and prepare the some production lines, assembly lines, textiles, computers, anything. They were producing something just for the purpose of having this opportunity to meet their loved ones, their brothers and sisters. And it was extremely important experience. North Koreans learned about what choco pie was. Choco pie, what choco pie is. And it turned into a proto-currency. Those ladies would get a bonus in the form of choco pie, and they could put it into the pocket and go to the market and sell and buy some rice. So it was an amazing experiment. South Koreans could even go to Kaesong, the ancient capital of Goryeo dynasty, when Korea was known for its beautiful celadon and wonderful architecture. For every Korean, it's an extremely important place. So you could get on the bus in Gwanghwamun, in the middle of Seoul, 1 hour drive across the demilitarized zone, and you are in the middle of your ancient capital in North Korea. Meeting, well, not necessarily meeting, but watching what's going on in North Korea. And country was, of course, North Korea was getting more money because of the tourism. Of course, North Koreans were learning new things about South Korea. And maybe that was the reason why this policy started choking. And at some stage, the politicians in the North and the South realized, well, if that happens in Kimgansan and Kaesong, and soon in Pyongyang, very soon North Koreans will realize that South Koreans live better, eat better, dress better than North Koreans. And the myth of peasants and workers' paradise will crumble. And that was the end of this policy. So during these 10 years of Sunshine Policy, almost, 2 million people visited North Korea. Lots of politicians from South Korea visited, and North Korean members of the National Defense Committee were in South. $1 billion per year, so roughly it's estimated $6 billion in currency was pumped into North Korean economy. For South Koreans, of course, it was too expensive, and the criticism was that North Koreans continued developing their nuclear program, which was symbolically important for North Korea. The relationship between North Korea and the United States was going extremely bad during the Bush administration. So North Korea detonated their first nuclear device. They launched the rockets. So for South Korea, it was, of course, quite damaging to continue this policy. South Koreans simply said it was too expensive. And North Koreans, too, they didn't want this policy to continue. It was too successful. The Sunshine Policy actually undermined the myth of North Korean superiority. It showed that the South Koreans live better, they are freer, better educated, and actually the future might lie in the realm of the South, or might come from the South rather than from the North. So the idea of unification under North Korean terms simply was in danger. And it was like one incident after another continued with death of a South Korean tourist, closure of the Kaesong industrial complex, particularly after the incidents, Cheonan incident, the Yeongpyeong Island shelling. No more cooperation. So what were the lessons of Sunshine Policy, which I believe was too advanced, too successful for its own time? It was, North and South Korea was simply not prepared for this huge pace of reconciliation which was lying in store. Joint developmental projects. So we see that it didn't bring much fruit, except for North and South Koreans actually learning about each other. South Koreans understood what's going on in the South, and actually Sunshine Policy led to the new spike in the so-called Nam-Nam 갈등, the conflict, ideological conflict between South Koreans themselves, because some realized, no, we can't live with North Koreans, they're different, and the others would say, well, you know, there was a generational change. Young South Koreans used to be, during 1970s, all young South Koreans were, you know, dreaming about unification, thinking about Marx, Engels, and reading secretly Kim Il-sung. I don't know what for, but that was their parallel education. They had to learn these things, while older generation were adamant, march north, unify, get rid of the, you know, Palgini communists under the bed. Yeah, McCarthyism was in South Korea. These days, what you can see is absolutely the opposite. The older generation, who know that they probably will never have another chance to see their loved ones, they dream about unification and think the sooner it happens, the better. While the younger generation is very conservative. Younger generation of South Koreans understand that they will need to pay the expense of unification, which is going to be very hefty. So with continuing like disintegration between North and South Korea, continuing, you know, Sunshine policy was scrapped. No communication, no relations. The North Koreans, of course, retaliated with the resumption of their own Songun 정치, their own army first policies. Hardline military emphasis, neglect of economy. It's something what Kim Jong-il proposed in 1990s as a retort, as a reaction to the famine, to the arduous march, so-called Konane Hengun. It was like the swing towards conservatism in North Korea. The hardliners in North Korea prevailed, continued detonating nuclear devices, continued launching rockets wherever, whether it was not absolutely necessary, destroying relations between North and South completely. When Kim Jong-il died, his son was chosen deliberately to continue the dynasty and be a harsh, perfect dictator who would continue this policy of nuclear and missile development. And that's what Kim Jong-un is doing. He's not going to renege on his promise to his father. But the interesting thing about the Pyongyang line, the parallel development line, the parallel development sort of policy, which was introduced by Kim Jong-un in 2013, gives the, kind of splits the focus from, not only the focus is diverted, not necessarily only on security, but economy as well. And people who have been to North Korea recently, I'm sure Peter saw that now it's booming. North Korean economy is growing at, well, maybe double-digit pace. We don't know. Official pace is what, 3.4? It's World Trade Organization, 3.4% annual growth of North Korean economy, more than South Korea. But in fact, I think it's more. The question is where do the money come from? It's not really, there's no answer to that question. The assumption is that the mountains, the natural resources, the vitamin of the 21st century, rare earth metals, very expensive. And North Korea has 90% of the world deposits of rare earth metals, plus high quality coal, high quality iron ore, molybdenum. Everything is in North Korea. That's something what South Korea desperately needs for its economy, which is overheated, which is with the high level of unemployment. If not unification, but cooperation between North and South would be absolutely necessary. So what Kim Jong-un is trying to achieve by his Pyongyang line, the parallel development, like two engines of the economy. One, basically every technology can be dual usage. Rockets can kill and can, put a satellite. Nuclear energy can be a killer, but can be a lifesaver for medicinal, for healthcare research, or whatever. So that's the secret of Pyongyang line. By having the one nuclear device, one psychological deterrent measure, North Koreans managed to remove or divert or channelize the funds from non-productive sectors of their economy, like military and security, and into productive, into markets, construction, research, energy production. And that's the secret of North Korean success. It's not just money, it's just the general idea. So, sunshine policy was not perfect. There are plenty of shortcomings. North and South Koreans are basically where they are. The demilitarized zone is there. They still don't talk. You can't make telephone call. You cannot see your loved ones. People still distrust each other. And, cultural projects which they started were never continued. Yes, North and South Koreans marched in Sydney Olympics under the unification flag, the blue peninsula on the white flag. Yes, North and South Koreans produced a number of historical texts for research, but it was disappointingly soon that this policy was discontinued for, again, obvious reason. For South Korea it was too expensive, for North Korea it was too damaging. The regime could not survive that bacilla of democracy coming into North Korea at a great pace. So what we see that the expectations of sunshine policy didn't live up, didn't bring the fruit which was expected. Basically, it failed. But did it fail forever? Will North Korea always stay separated, divided? Will Koreans in North and South never, visit each other and continue to be antagonized? Well, there are three questions I think must be raised to come closer to the answer. So what model should we plan for this unification? Because there are a number of models. German, East, West Germany, North, South, Vietnam, they unified happily. But would these models be suitable for the Korean example, Korean society, Korean landscape? And also, how much this unification cost? Is it worth it, trying to unify peninsula right now or soon and incur a multi-trillion-dollar bill? And who is going to pay for this? So, well, these two examples are quite different, and I don't want to compare Korea with Germany, because you see, if you look at East Germany, and I grew up in the Soviet Union, and I remember when my father went to East Germany in early 80s, we looked, wow, East Germany is like West, it's a prosperous country. So East Germany was the most prosperous country of the communist bloc. So the level of prosperity of East Germany and West Germany was different, but it's not as different as North Korea, which always was the poorest country of the communist bloc, well, after 1980s, after the collapse of the bloc, and the 11th largest economy in the world, South Korea. Vietnamese example, again, it was a war of unification. 1973, the fall of Saigon. I don't think anyone is going to repeat that. North Korea is not prepared. They simply don't have the military capability to unify the North by force. They will be wiped out. South Korea, much North unifying, probably not. Too expensive, too damaging, and not worth it. So these two examples don't stand. A little bit of Korean history. Well, Koreans always try to unify the peninsula. If you look, well, the mythical old Choson, yes, the Haraboji, Tangun Haraboji created the old Choson. That was good, but say there was a fight between Koguryo, Paekche, and Silla, ancient kingdoms, who tried on the peninsula, like in the first century before and after Christ. They're trying to, dominate. It was not a unification of harmonization, it was unification of domination, and finally, which country prevailed? Which kingdom prevailed? Silla did. Silla unified the peninsula, but even not fully, because those who disagreed, who didn't want to live under Silla, ran away to Parhe, Bohai. Parhe was the kingdom of there. So there was always kind of centripetal kind of intentions of Koreans wanted to live together, but those who disagreed would always stand by and organize their own life independently. So the strive for homogeneity always presented in Korean culture. Emphasis on common ethnicity and language and history and blood traditions was always emphasized. Koreans always talked about this dream of unification and restoration of the unified state of now Koryo was the first unified state and continued. Actually, Choson dynasty was the unified state, which I'll show you in the next slide. The first time Korea became unified was with Koryo, and Kaesong was the capital of it. Why is it important that Koreans actually managed to iron out their differences? Because Northerners always had their own identity, slight accent, sort of more continental thinking, different climate, right? People in the north, they drink strong vodka. South Koreans don't. Different climate, different mentality, different slang. People in Jeju don't understand people in Hamgyeong-pukto, although it's supposed to be the same country. So when Koryo was unified, yes, Koreans lived a glorious, happy, but poor life. They kept fighting the foreigners, continuing invasions, continuing, and Yi dynasty, Choson, the longest dynasty in East Asia, actually also saw the deterioration of economic prosperity, constant rebellions, constant uprisings of peasants. Again, poverty and unhappiness continued in Korean history, but the sense of identity, of Korean identity, was quite strong. And what happened with the Japanese colonization, coming back to this again, Japan started, colonial Japan started trading the interests of Koreans to the other nations, the Taft-Katsura Agreement, exchanging the independence of Korea for independence of the Philippines, like secret diplomacy. With Japanese colonial rule advancing some territories, this Kando area, Tiandao area of China, always belonged to Korea, and Japanese sold it to Qing dynasty. So that's why China is so sensitive to the potential unification of Korea. If Korea, North and South, unify one day, they may say, by the way, in 1909, you gave this Yanbian area to the Chinese. It was ours. And according to the San Francisco Peace Treaty, all international agreements signed with and by Imperial Japan after 1905 must be null and void. So it opens a Pandora box of legal international conflicts, litigations, which we don't know where going to lead us. So this, you see this homogeneity, of course it's important, but heterogeneity, the differences, as just mentioned, differences in accent, differences in mentality, differences, social, political, became in the last 70 years of total separation. From 1945, basically North and South Koreans lived separately. No visits, no telephone calls, no letters permitted, no news, no radio. Listening South Korean radio in North Korea is a crime. People are imprisoned. Even these days, Kim Jong-un is cracking down on people who watch Chinese films and watch Chinese media and have Chinese mobile phones. So the strong nationalism in North Korea is emphasized. Xenophobia, anti-Americanism is so rampant in North Korea, and this is the means for the regime survival. Because for Kim Jong-un, it is important to demonstrate to his people that we Koreans are incompatible with Western lifestyle. While South Korea is part of global economy, it's export-oriented nation. South Korea cannot imagine itself being outside, not part of the world trade and political process in the United Nations arena. So two systems are completely incompatible. Economy-wise, you see the differences striking. Still, the population is half of what it is in the South. The GDP is just a fraction of what South Korea is producing. Well, this data is not the most updated, but I can assure you it's the divide is growing even further. But North Korea, the process I just mentioned, North Korea managed to sell its skills and natural resources, and North Korean workforce is quite disciplined, hardworking. Tens of thousands of North Korean workers are sent to China and Russia, Southeast Asia and the Middle East and East Europe, and they bring hard currency. And this hard currency used probably partly to develop their nuclear and missile programs, but also pumped into the national economy. More high-rise apartments, more cars on the streets, more. It's Pyongyang. I was there last year. Pyongyang turned into a city of lights. There, the theme parks, like a lot of world Pyongyang style operates, every night. But all electricity is diverted into this, so they kind of have to switch off electricity everywhere to give people a little bit of entertainment. Beer festivals. Actually, beer festival was cancelled this year. Air shows in Wonsan. I mean, last year was an air show. I couldn't believe it. But they cancelled it this year as well. I think because Americans and South Koreans now continuing the military exercises, so just to avoid confusion. So both North and South Korea economically they're growing. They are developing. They are continuing their strong march towards success, but different ways. What can be done in order to synchronize their efforts to make the people live better, healthier, longer lives? Well, I think they should stop the Korean War. And how can they do this? Well, again, if you remember this demilitarized zone which separates the peninsula, there's a joint security area known as the Truce Village. I'm sure many of you, if not everyone, visited it. It's the scariest place in the world. But that's one of the few interfaces where North and South Koreans currently face each other. Unfortunately, just the two militaries, two large armies confronting. There's a standoff between U.S. allied South Korean Republic of Korean Army and North Korean People's Army. The joint military exercises really scare the North Korean regime because they believe that every time the military exercises happen in the south, it's a preparation for invasion. That's why they need something to kind of demonstrate the possibility of retaliation, a nuclear one. It's a scary scenario. The problem with all this, well, it has been quite a stable system for last 64 years after the armistice agreement. There were some violations of armistice. There was some skirmishing, but it never transgressed into the full war. You remember even the Yongpyeong-do Island shelling could have turned into Korean War, but it didn't. The Cheonan corvette sinking, again, it was a tragedy. It was very near, very close to war, but it didn't turn to the war because of the armistice agreement. It has the safeguards, and potentially nobody can imagine the new war on the Korean Peninsula, too devastating. Like millions of people dead just in the first days or weeks of the war, trillions of dollars of damage in infrastructure. So the war, the military option is unimaginable. How can we stop this Korean War? We have to understand what Koreans in North and South want. What do North Koreans want? People. Not regime, not Kim Jong-un. They want safety. They want security, because every day in every newspaper and every radio broadcast, North Korea tells them that the war is imminent, that the enemy, they were surrounded by the enemy, that the capitalists, planning, crafting to destroy the republic. So what North Koreans need, they want security assurance, that there won't be no war, that no attack. They don't want to die. That's pretty simple. Regime, the elites, the party bureaucrats don't want to die either. They have their own vested interest in this. For that, they need the diplomatic recognition, because something, you can't reform your economy without, or you can't you can't do proper trade without being diplomatically recognized. First of all, by the United States. If you remember, when China was recognized by the United States in 1979. Before there was Maoist China, Gang of Four. Nobody would trade with China. Well, it was a scary place. After 1979, it just took off. The Chinese economy, 30 years later, second largest economy in the world. So if North Koreans need the diplomatic recognition by the United States, that's why they strive to directly talk to Washington. Not in six-party talks, not with participation of too many participants, but directly with the US. And finally, they need the lifting of economic sanctions, which bite, which impede the economy, which create a lot of trouble. But all these three goals are interlinked. So security assurance, diplomatic recognition, and the lifting of economic sanctions cannot be done without Washington's green light. But also South Korea's role here is also important. If Americans recognize North Korea diplomatically, how would the Republic of Korea feel? Betrayed. Former President Clinton planned a trip to Pyongyang back in 2000. I believe there was intention to diplomatically recognize North Korea. Just before that, what happened? When did New Zealand establish diplomatic relations with North Korea? 2001. So that Australia did it in year 2000. Canada did approximately the same time. So it was the background, the kind of the environment was already getting prepared that next diplomatic recognition will come from the United States. But there was a constitutional crisis, recounting of votes. President George W. Bush came to power, and it was like what happened to the Sunshine Policy happened to this intention of the United States to look at North Korea favorably. No more. Confrontation continued. What do South Koreans want? South Koreans want to live happy, peaceful, prosperous, predictable life. It's simple. And that's what former President Park Geun-hye was talking about. Her thesis of unification as a bonanza, as a bonus. If we unify, we'll live a much wealthier life, because North Korea is full of resources, brothers and sisters who speak the same language. They will help us, we'll help them, and we'll live happily since ever. Thereafter. But the problem with South Korean attitude, the current South Korean attitude, you see, under Kim Tae-jung's government, you remember, Kim Tae-jung never talked about unification. He talked about reconciliation and cooperation. But North Koreans didn't trust him. They knew this, sticks and carrots, and these carrots are going to be poisoned. Don't trust South Koreans. So that's why they discontinued the Sunshine Policy. With President Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye was much more straightforward. Unification by absorption. Unification on South Korean terms. North Korea is not going to be recognized as independent or as a legitimate entity. Full stop. So the question is, who is going to pay for this unification? South Korean taxpayers. And I don't think they are very keen to do so. So that's why the current appetite for unification in South Korea is quite low. DPRK Peace Treaty, just to finalize this proposal for comprehensive peace treaty. It should be a comprehensive peace regime, like a comprehensive security assurance, which North Korea is claiming. Yes, Americans may or may not give it to them, but the peace treaty is something what both North and South Koreans really need. It will require a joint, official declaration of Korean War to be over. I think former President Clinton was prepared to do so. How many? 50,000 American lives, 332 Australians died, numerous Korean lives lost. Even Russians participated in that war secretly. So this war has to be finished. Without ending the war, we cannot address the issue of nuclear and missile proliferation, testing, and experimentation. If the war is over, there's no need for new weapons. Who is going to detonate the bomb if there is no war, if the security assurance is given? Simple tasks first, complex tasks later. Recognize each other's sovereignty. Well, is Pyongyang ready to recognize Republic of Korea? Unlikely. Republic of Korea is not going to recognize DPRK either. So this plan for war sounds like quite idealistic right now, but who knows? Maybe President Moon Jae-in has a better plan how to achieve that. Maybe this right for existence can be emphasized. Well, if Kim Tae-jung and Kim Jong-il manage to meet, maybe Moon Jae-in can meet with Kim Jong-un and discuss this in detail. So these countries, again, we don't need to talk about unification of institutions. Their foreign policy can be different. Their security alliances can be different. in the future they may talk about, like have some kind of referendum where they will discuss periodically. Is it good time to reunify? Potentially, yeah. Right now, South Koreans say that it's not good time even to talk to the North. Disappointingly. It's always good time to talk. And this, finally down the track, if this plan is accepted, if South Korea decides to recognize that the North Korean state has the right for existence, if North Koreans freeze or remove, completely destroy and suspend at least their nuclear and military and missile program, they would do it only if South Koreans and Americans stop their joint military exercises. If they stop bringing new weapons and new technology, anti-missile technology systems to the peninsula, then it's possible to resume the dialogue. Right now, there's simply total impasse. But down the track, if these conditions are observed, there's no need for new weapons. And one more important condition should be, because there's not only North and South Koreans, right, in the region. There's also China, who has some concerns. What will happen if North and South Korea unify? Is going to be still pro-American, like American security ally in the region, and American troops to be moving closer to the Chinese border. Russia is there as well, so they know that it's going to be the economy going to be American, controlled by American multinational enterprise, multinational corporations. So there won't be much place in the unified Korean market for Russian-made products, aircrafts, whatever. So one important condition for successful this comprehensive peace agreement, peace regime, is the neutrality of Korea. Chung-nip. So Korea, I believe, has to declare that it's neutral, non-allied, non-nuclear, peaceful, and this would give some certainty to the surrounding nations not to fight about Korea. Korea will stop being the bone of contention. It has been for quite a long time. It does need to be more, and this would actually lead to the final, reunification of North Korea. When it's going to be, that's a big question. So there's final possible scenarios. This coexistence may continue for quite a while. It can be peaceful coexistence or can be hostile. Currently, it's a hostile coexistence. Not even one telephone line of communication between North and South Korea. When it's peaceful coexistence, they're still two different states, but they talk. What's the alternative? It's unification, but again, it can be a happy unification, peaceful, 평화 통일, or it can be a violent unification with numerous loss of life, destruction, and potentially ecological disaster. So which one is most likely? That's up to Koreans to answer. So I would like to finish my presentation with the words from the song which we just sang today. 통일이여 오라, unification, come soon. Thank you.